Hello, my name is Kenny Emil Aunstrup, and I will present my PhD project called Predicting Longitudinal Complication Patterns in Type 2 Diabetes. My PhD project has two major parts. First of all, a descriptive part, and then after that, a predictive part. In the descriptive part, I will define and analyze groups of type 2 diabetes longitudinal complication patterns for the entire Danish population. And then later on, by using electronic health records, then predict which of these complication groups a newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes patient will end up in. In order to find my diabetes cohort, I use the Diabetes Register. I find type 2 diabetes patients and their onset, and I use hospital diagnosis for diabetes and pharmacy prescriptions for anti-diabetic drugs. Then, whichever of these two comes first will be the onset date. In order to find the complication patterns, I use hospital diagnosis for my type 2 diabetes cohort and compare these diagnoses to non-diabetes controls, which is matched with sex and age. Then I calculate statistically significant diagnosis pairs for my cohort and putting these pairs together to 3 consecutive diseases, which I call a trajectory. A trajectory thereby is first starting with type 2 diabetes, then later on in time the patient gets another diagnosis, another complication, and then later on in time again a patient gets a third diagnosis. I only look at length 3 trajectories starting with type 2 diabetes, and I get around 1000 of these for my cohort. Then I do hierarchical clustering. In each cluster is a group of several longitudinal trajectories. Each patient can have a trajectory in multiple groups, and this also makes clinical sense as a patient can have different types of complications. For my work, I've chosen a threshold cutoff point that gives me 6 clusters. This is quite arbitrary, and for future work I will choose a cutoff point and an amount of clusters that optimizes my prediction. In these slides I show what is in my 6 clusters, and I only show the trajectories which have the largest relative risk in each clusters. For cluster 1, all my patients have myocardial infarction or COPD. In cluster 2, it's kind of a mixed cluster. In cluster 3, all my patients have some types of cerebral vascular complications, for example stroke. In cluster 4, all my patients have eye complications. In cluster 5, all my patients have some type of cardiovascular complications, and then later on leading into kidney complications. And here we can see the temporal aspect and longitudinal aspects of this, because we first have cardiovascular leading into kidney complications. Then cluster 6 is kind of also a mixed cluster, but with a focus on arteriosclerosis. And now to the prediction part. I will use survival analysis, which can handle censored data, and my cohort is censored in 2023, so many of my patients haven't had enough time to develop their complication because my study ends at this time point. I'll create a competing risk model for each of my 6 clusters, where I will include all the same patients in each of the 6 clusters, around 80,000 patients. All of these patients have some electronic health data. I have the competing event, which is death. And I use a standard train test split for this, 80% to 20%. I use random survival forest as a model, and I have around 6,000 features, which are prescriptions, diagnosis, procedures, clinical data extracted from text nodes by text mining, then laboratory values and other baseline variables. And here for the results, I use the area under the rock curve as a metric, and the event is complication or death within 6 months from debut. The event for complication is first time a patient follows a trajectory in the cluster, and by mean follow, it is the first time the patient have both of the diseases after type 2 diabetes in the length 3 trajectory. We can see the ROC AOC values all are between 70 and 80. For future work, I'll create a multi-state model where patient can shift between group stages, and this is shown here below for 3 complication groups. And I will thank my group, Søren Broner's group.